If I start with the data centre as an industry, I mean, that's where Broad Group with its consultancy started from. I mean, obviously, prior to 10 years ago, there were very uninteresting buildings where networks just converged and met up and interconnected. But with the growth of the internet and growth of certain services which made their home within the data centre, quite by accident, an entire industry appeared. This has led to quite a few global companies entering what is now a data centre market and running them as a business. I mean, obviously you've got the likes of Equinix, which started off in the US, bought IX Europe across Europe, and has a presence over here in Asia. They're really the only large-scale global service, probably following shortly afterwards. I split those out from, obviously Google and Amazon have very, very large data centres, but theirs are data centres for their own businesses as opposed to running a data centre business. There is a perception across the industry that data centre as a business is purely a property business, which can sometimes lead to sort of lower values being placed on it because this is a bit of an office block, only less interesting. This isn't quite right. There are obviously the global switches out there and digital realty companies that build them and lease them out on a large scale and run them as a property business. But the companies we're interested in as a business and the countries and the companies that we've conducted research into, they're service level players within the whole telecoms infrastructure. So that's where we are with data centres as a building and run as a business. Data centres as a whole umbrella term covers far more than just the Equinix and Savis and players of the world. It covers anything from a small server room in the back of someone's office to one NHS arm within the UK, I won't say which one, was actually running its servers and its computer room in a leaky basement up until about 2 months. So, even large organisations sometimes didn't quite catch on to the fact that maybe this wasn't the best thing to be doing. So what has been happening on quite a large scale over the past 4 to 5 years, it's really taken off, is companies moving their actual server operations into a dedicated data centre facility, either one that they've built or leased from a property player themselves, or into a third-party data centre where they will run their own equipment and run it within the data centre, but they're leasing the space and taking the equipment out of their own buildings. Data centre value chain, really basically just reiterating what I've just said, starting off as a property play, then it's moving in different areas. So you'd start off with a pure property play where you build the shell and core, lease it out, and all you're concerned with is the rents coming in from that building. Going up to more of a management issue, the Equinix is the Savis, where they will rent out portions on a smaller scale. They will provide some basic housing of the equipment and occasionally some management of that equipment with it. Then you move further up to a layer where they're adding on managed services. Now, quite a lot of the companies, certainly in Europe, are trying to generate more income per square footage because the space is running out. They don't want to invest more in new facilities, so they're trying to get as much money out of each customer as they possibly can. Then right at the very top, you have the hosting companies, which has a value chain all of its own, where their entire business is about managing their customers' network infrastructure themselves on a shared infrastructure. At the very top of that individual value chain, you have the likes of the Googles and the Amazons, where their data centres are purely for their own customers and their own business, but on a huge, massive global scale. It depends on country to country to region to region. There is generalised. As a generalised, there's the perception of needing to be green. Now, data centres inherently are not green buildings. They produce an awful lot of they take up an awful lot of power, they need a lot of cooling. They're never going to be what the environmentalists would class as being green. There are obviously ways that they can get around that, but there is no way that they can suddenly turn themselves round to being completely carbon neutral. And if you find a data centre that claims to be completely carbon neutral, that means they're paying for credit somewhere and they're planting trees. It doesn't mean they're not using any power. That's one of the issues, and that's something that globally is becoming more and more of an issue. Governments getting involved in the US and across in Europe in terms of legislation from the EU coming out, legislation from the US to try and put limits on the carbon emissions that data centres can produce. Space is another issue. 10 years ago, it was a fairly simple process to find a piece of land to build a data centre. And when you're looking at the size of some of the data centres that larger companies want to build today, it's very difficult, certainly in certain countries, to actually find that land available, get the planning, and then have access, never mind the power issues once it's there, actually getting access to that power in the first place can be a seriously major obstacle. They're probably the three biggest. It's good. There's still investment in the area, so that's not a problem. There's still customers, so that's not a problem. But the greening, the power availability, and the land availability are three quite serious obstacles.